Hey, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to talk about a really important issue, something that I talk about at every single bike club that I meet, in the meetings that I go to, at bike shops. Whenever I lecture, this is always included as one of my really important topics, right up there with no fault and what to do after a crash. And that's something that people don't know that they quite often have, and that's called supplemental uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage, or what's also known as SUM or some coverage. So what is SUM or uninsured motorist coverage? In New York State, we have a combined endorsement on our policies. So if you own a vehicle and you look at your auto policy at the declaration sheet or the deck sheet, you're going to see a list of endorsements. And on there is going to have your liability coverage, your property damage coverage, and also something called supplemental uninsured motorist coverage or some coverage. So let's break these out. They're two different coverages and they do two different things and they help you in two different ways. Let's talk first about supplemental uninsured motorist coverage. So the minimum amount of insurance in New York State that a vehicle can have is $25,000 in coverage. So if I'm hit by a car, that car has $25,000. That's the most I can collect. It's a double endorsement, meaning it's $25.50 is the minimum. So the minimum, or rather the maximum one person can collect is $25,000. But if one or more people are injured by that vehicle, then it converts to $50,000, but no one person can collect more than 25. So if it's two people, each would get 25. If it's three people, they would have to split the 50. All right, so that's minimum insurance. So what can you do to protect yourself? On your auto policy, you're going to have something called the sum coverage. Let's use by example, you have $100,000 in coverage. If you're struck by a vehicle that has $25,000, after you collect that $25,000 from that vehicle insurance that struck you, you then have another $75,000 available with your own carrier to collect. In New York, they've made a really good change that hopefully will stay in effect. And right now, your sum coverage, or your uninsured motorist coverage, is going to be at least equal to your liability coverage. So automatically right now, you have $100,000 in liability coverage, you have $100,000 in supplemental uninsured motorist coverage, unless you choose to opt out. And most people choose not to. It used to be you had to elect for that additional coverage, but they passed a law saying that in order that it would remain consistent with your liability coverage, and if you wanted to reduce it, you would have to go to your carrier and ask them to do that. So that is supplemental uninsured motorist coverage. And that's coverage if you're struck by a car that doesn't have enough coverage to compensate you for your injury. Now let's talk about uninsured motorist coverage. Although they're on the same line endorsement and they're called some coverage, they're two different types of coverage. Underinsured motorist coverage is if you're struck by a vehicle that is uninsured, you're involved in a hit and run, or the policy is lapsed, or maybe it's a stolen vehicle, or some other condition that has created that vehicle to now be uninsured. So if that occurs, you can tap into your uninsured motorist vehicle coverage in order to collect under that policy. And obviously, if there's no insurance by that other car, you now have the full value of that endorsement. If it's $100,000, you now have $100,000 available to you. Now, one of the things that you're typically going to need, especially in a hit and run, is that the crash needs to be reported to the police within 24 hours, and they're trying to reduce fraud. So one of my caveats is always to call the police, but here's one of the reasons we're doing it. So we can report the crash to the police within 24 hours, and typically it requires contact between the vehicle and yourself. And again, I'm talking now about bicycles and pedestrians, but all these coverages will also be in effect if you're in a car. So if you're in a car crash and the car that struck you has minimal coverage, you can access your uninsured motorist coverage. If you are in a car crash and a hit and run, you can access the uninsured motorist coverage. Obviously helps you if you're a pedestrian, obviously helps you greatly if you're a cyclist as well. It is not probably, the most important insurance you can purchase that actually protects you versus protecting somebody else. So I can tell you by example, I carry $1 million in uninsured motorist coverage because I see what happens on a daily basis about uninsured vehicles, underinsured vehicles, and hit and run crashes. So I want to be able to protect myself and protect my family. So on that issue, who is protected? This coverage will cover anybody who resides under your household. So if your spouse, your children, or anybody residing in your home is involved in a crash, they too as well can access this uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage. And let's talk a little bit about cost. I just said I have $1 million in coverage. That costs me about $120 every 6 months. When you are paying for insurance, the bulk of your payment is going to your liability insurance, right? How much coverage you have if you strike somebody else and they sue you, how much insurance coverage do you have to protect you from that claim? This is the one insurance that you're purchasing now to protect yourself, right? So that insurance, that liability insurance, that's costly. That's the bulk of your premium. However, this conditional endorsement, this additional endorsement of some coverage is not going to be close to the cost of what your liability coverage is. So take a look at that. And the other thing you need to know is your sum coverage can't be more than your liability coverage. So if you want to have this large supplemental uninsured motorist coverage, you're going to have equal liability coverage. So for 100,000 liability, you can get 100,000 sum. For 250 liability, you can get 250 sum. They just have to be equal to each other. So that's a little talk about supplemental uninsured motorist coverage, and be safe, be well. Talk soon.